All right, well, I am Sophie. I'm an AmeriCorps Vista working with Land to Hand, Montana, and I would just like to welcome you all here today to listen on Pickling with Julie Laing. I just want to introduce our board member, Emily Hess. Thank you for being here today, and please start us off.
Cool. Hi, all. Welcome to our 7th annual Free the Seeds Fair. This is our second and final time doing a virtual event. Free the Seeds is a community-based project of Land to Hand, Montana, formerly Farm Hands, Nourish the Flathead, and is rooted in building a sustainable and resilient future through real seeds, real food, and real skills. Land to Hand's mission is to build a strong community food system that fosters socially just ways of accessing food. Free the Seeds provides all of us an avenue to build that system. While this is a free event, it takes time and money to make that happen. If you would like to support these efforts, please go to landtohandmt.org and donate through the donate button on the homepage or the donate link on the Free the Seeds page. We will also provide the link in the chat. Finally, we want to thank this year's major sponsors, Box of Rain Organic Garden Center, who offers gardening supplies and classes in Kalispell. We will link their website in the chat. And Save Farmland, a new nonprofit based in Whitefish, working to preserve farmland. And finally, you, our amazing seed savers who grew and saved seeds for us to package. This year's seed giveaway, 75% of the seeds were saved by our community, which is super cool. So you'll have Julie Laing presenting on pickling your garden. Pickling is a safe, easy way to preserve almost any vegetable. And if you garden, you'll want to save some of your yield to savor later. Local food writer Julie Laing has plenty of ideas to tantalize your taste buds. She's the author of The Complete Guide to Pickling cookbook and the Twice as Tasty column for the Flathead Beacon, named after her food blog. This Free the Seeds workshop will help you choose what to plant for the best pickles, introduce you to the basic science behind pickling, and show you how to customize your pickles to fit your produce and time frame. Julie will offer suggestions for what you can grow to enjoy mealtime pickles that are ready in minutes, refrigerator pickles ideal for single jar batches, fermented pickles big on flavor and crunch, or processed pickles perfect for long-term storage. We'll add Julie's website in the chat where you can buy her fabulous book.
All right, so we'll just hand it over to Julie. We're excited to learn a lot. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody. And thanks to so many people for showing up to attend for this. I know we'd all rather be in person, but it is kind of nice to be able to pack a larger room than I could ever do at Flathead Valley Community College. So I'm really excited all of you are here. I am going to share my screen with you now. I've put together some slides to go with my talk. That'll help you get a sense of where we're going here for today. All right. So as our fabulous co-host here from Land to Hand, Montana said, I am Julie Laing. I am the author of The Complete Guide to Pickling, as well as the food blog Twice as Tasty. And today, obviously, we're going to be talking about pickles. As Emily mentioned, pickling is safe, easy, endlessly variable, and it is a fabulous thing if you also happen to be a gardener, because it is a great way to preserve all sorts of food. And we're going to talk about a lot of those options today. So besides Twice as Tasty and The Complete Guide to Pickling, I've also put together an ebook called The Pickled Picnic that has recipes that help you use your pickles and your brines, and recently started writing a weekly column for the Flathead Beacon. You can also see some of the things we're going to talk about today, including this entire program and the video we're going to share during it, and a couple of other demo videos through the Free the Seeds workshop video archive. As I say in the opening to The Complete Guide to Pickling in the introduction, I have pickled brine in my blood. And I grew up making pickles. My grandmother and my mother were home canners. My father was a gardener. And when I started traveling, I learned to eat and travel and enjoy food almost as much as anything else I saw in the places I visited. I've been pickling and preserving now in Montana for the last 18 years, and I started the Twice as Tasty Food blog back in 2016. And so when I went to write my cookbook, I pulled all of that experience together to create pickles from all sorts of places, all sorts of food. There's a lot of variety in there. It includes 125 recipes. So obviously we cover a lot of different pickling options. And a lot of those still, even though I reach broader for some things like mangoes that we don't grow here, a lot of those still are foods that I grow in my own garden here in Montana. And a lot of you will be able to do as well if you so choose. So when it comes to pickling your garden, what I really find most important to think about first is what to plant. And then we're going to talk about that first here today, and then we'll move on to some of the basic science of pickling, and we'll talk about pickles that you can make for any schedule, any occasion. And this is going to help you learn how to get pickling with what you're growing in your own space. So right off the bat, what is a pickle? My very broad definition of a pickle is a food that has been preserved with acid. And that covers a whole lot of area. That might be a whole or sliced vegetable packed in brine. It could be a relish. It could be a salsa. It could be a condiment like hot sauce or mustard. It can even expand to proteins, fish, eggs, beverages. There's all sorts of things that can be preserved with acid that put them in this category of pickle. And we're going to use that really broad definition today to talk about some of the options you can pickle from your own garden. So in terms of pickles themselves, I've categorized them in my book and often in the way I approach pickles when I'm out in the garden deciding what to do in how they get processed. We're going to break them down into 4 categories today. Quick pickles can be, some of them can be ready in minutes, certainly within 24 hours. Refrigerated pickles, they take a little bit longer, but you can store them in the fridge and they're great for when you just want to pickle 1 jar of something at a time. Fermented pickles are some of my favorites because you've got salt brine and it gives you this amazing flavor and crunch. They also take a bit of time, so you have to plan that accordingly if you want to enjoy them at a certain period. And then processed pickles are, in my mind, kind of the last category of pickles because by heat processing them, you can change some of the texture and quality of your pickles, but they do have advantages. You can can them, you can store them, and some things where the texture doesn't matter so much, like a salsa, it can be really good options for processing. As far as what to plant, if you want to make pickles, literally A to Z, asparagus to zucchini, are all things you can choose to pickle. As I mentioned, I've got 125 recipes in my cookbook, so we're talking about a lot of pickling options. And some of these are probably familiar to everybody. We've got some of our classic choices. Pickling cucumbers, of course, as Americans, that's what we think of usually when we think of a pickle is a cucumber. Asparagus, beets, cabbage, carrots. Some of these things, all of us are common to seeing as pickles and eating as pickles. But there's a lot of other things that you can pickle that grow really well here in Montana and can be a lot of fun to pickle and preserve that way. I started making miso pickles out of apples when I was working on this cookbook, and they've become one of my favorites, where the apples get marinated in a miso that pickles and preserves them. Cherries, pickled cherries are a fun option if you want to take something that's often really sweet and turn it into a more savory thing. Nasturtium seeds have been one of my favorites for a long time. They essentially are a North American version of capers. And instead of buying capers, you can just save your nasturtium seeds, not only to plant again next year, but you can save others and pickle them up. So there's a huge list of options that we may never think of as pickling, but if you think the way I do, you pretty much look at everything and go, I wonder if that could be pickled. And in terms of options of what you can pickle, besides just thinking about, okay, can I pickle that? You can also think about, am I going to do it just as a pickle, as a whole vegetable or fruit, or am I going to turn it into something else? A relish, a hot sauce, a chutney, salsa, other condiments, beverages. When you start to think that way, you're going to find that just about everything in your garden is probably eligible for some sort of pickle. And it was a lot of fun when I worked on my book to be able to play with some of these broader options. As an example, plums have become one of my favorite things for a chutney. And particularly since I happen to have plum trees where I garden and apple trees, I do an Italian plum apple chutney that's absolutely delicious. And I put it on just about everything. Even though we often think of a chutney as an Indian thing, it's a fabulous one for toast with brie, whatever you want to enjoy. And I can get that fresh flavor all winter long as I'm enjoying the stuff that I've set up and preserved and pickled. So we can think not just about, okay, here I've got a cucumber, it's in a jar, I'm going to put it on my burger or whatever else, but we can think to all these broader options and still put this concept of pickling together. So with so many options, then becomes the next challenge, which is how are you going to narrow down your choices? And that's really an important thing that is often, if you're an experienced gardener, you probably know it's very easy at the beginning of the season to get overwhelmed and put in far more than you can manage later on. If you're a new gardener, you're going to learn that really fast. So I really like to think about how I want to plant not just my whole garden, but also specifically what I want to pickle by what do I want to eat and when do I want to eat it? Because if I'm going to pickle cucumbers and I'm going to grow so many of them that my husband has to reinforce my refrigerator shelves because I've put all my ferments in there. Yes, this is how this works. Then I need to be prepared to handle and deal with all those pickles. And I need to know that we're going to eat them because there's no point in doing all that effort if they're just going to go to waste at the end. So when it comes to planning your garden in particular and pickling garden in particular, who will grow it? Are you going to grow it? Are you going to purchase what you want to pickle? It might be the best option if you want to do canning and have everything ready all at once. So rather than trying to grow your own and get it all timed right. And what will you and your family eat? If your kids don't eat green beans and they certainly don't eat them in vinegar, then there's not a whole lot of point of growing a lot of green beans and especially ones to pickle. You also need to think about where you will store it. As I said, my refrigerator has been reinforced to hold gallons of fermented food, but not everybody wants to go that route or has that space. I live in a really tiny house, so we built shelving in the mudroom for all of my canned goods. But I have a really tiny chest freezer, so I have to be pretty judicious about what goes in there. So when it comes to your preserving and your pickling, think about those things before you even start putting seeds in the ground, and you'll be much happier by the time you get to the end of the run. I call this process gardening from the kitchen. So it's really that idea of I'm going to start with the back end. What is it that I want to have? And then I'll work backwards and decide how much do I want to plant? What varieties do I want to plant? How big do I want to go? When you're gardening to pickle, there are a few other considerations. One of the first thing is plant varieties that are ideal for pickling. And I'm going to talk specifically here about pickling cucumbers because that's a really important one. If you plant slicing cucumbers or even lemon cucumbers, they may be great to eat and you enjoy them fresh, and they make really great quick pickles. But as soon as you try to preserve them any longer, whether it's by a refrigerator pickle, a ferment, or a canned pickle, they're going to get softer and mushier faster than if you go with pickling cucumbers, which have a lower water content to start with. So picking out a pickling cucumber variety is a really wise thing to do if that's what you're planning to do with the bulk of your pickles. And that applies to a lot of other things too. Check out the options and make sure that, if you're going to be pickling peppers, you've got a pepper variety that you're going to want to eat out of the jar, for example. It's also helpful here in Montana to choose short duration, high yield plants if you want to pickle, because a lot of times you're going to want to have at least a jar of things at a time. And if you want to pickle a larger batch, you're going to want several pounds at a time. If you intend to can anything, definitely want to try to get all of your plants to put out their yield in the same time window so everything's ready to go when you need to use it. At the same time, you don't want to get too out of control and spend your entire summer canning unless that's what you love. So limit your bumper crops to just a couple of vegetables. If you're like, this year, I'm going to can beans and I'm going to pickle snap beans and they're going to be fantastic and delicious and I want to ferment some too, go big on your bean crop. But you may want to plant fewer, say, pickling cucumbers this year so that you don't have to deal with those all at the same time. Another thing, especially if you are getting new into pickling and preserving, fermenting, and in particular canning, is to stock up on the supplies you need toward the beginning of the season. With the explosion in gardening and canning and preserving since the pandemic, we've seen shortages of jars and lids in particular for canning. And it seems like things are getting a little bit better, but they were still a challenge last year, and I would not be surprised if we're in short supply this year. So those are kind of things to start looking for early rather than, oh, everything's ready today, I'm going to go out and buy my jars to can and pickle. Get that stuff stockpiled a little bit ahead of time if you know you're going to use it this season, because you don't want to have to be running around trying to find something that nobody has in stock at the last minute when you're ready to pickle and your produce is at its peak. So that's gardening to pickle. We're going big, we're going to pickle, we know it, we're going to start that way in the season. The other end is what I would call opportunistic pickling. You aren't really sure you want to do pickling, you aren't really sure you want to invest in, preserving equipment, fermenting, canning equipment, or anything like that. But you're going to grow a garden and you like pickles and you like to have them every so often. So these are great things where you can explore different recipes and flavors and decide what you like. And if you're harvesting a pound of produce or less, that's a great opportunity to make a refrigerator pickle or a quick pickle, and something you can experiment with just one job at a time. And when you do that, then you have a chance to, give it a taste test, see what you think, see what your family and friends think. It also gives you a chance to be like, I don't have a lot of fridge space. I've got kids, it's packed, it's full. I'm just going to pickle one jar. And when we finish it and we eat it, I'm going to pickle the next jar. So there's definitely options to plan to garden to pickle, but there are also options to pickle just when you feel like you need one and your garden's in its full swing. So as we mentioned earlier, when I was talking about pickle categories, quick and refrigerator pickles, to my mind, are ideal things to make when you've got a pound or less of produce, because you're going to make them quickly. They aren't going to take very much time to prepare, and you're probably going to want to eat them pretty quickly. Some pickles, quick pickles, tend to want to be eaten fairly quickly, as well as be made quickly. Refrigerator pickles, some of them can last for months, but a lot of times, you're going to eat them faster than you ever have to worry about them getting past their prime. Fermented pickles, a lot of times it works best if you're able to harvest a couple pounds of produce just for the size of the jars you might use and the time that it takes for the ferment to happen. Processing pickles, if you're going to spend, especially in summer, you're going to fire up a canning kettle and you're going to let that bubble away in your kitchen and heat up the whole space. You want to have several pounds of produce so that you can at least get a full batch, if not a couple of batches at a time, to my mind. There are people who do small batch canning, and that is certainly always an option. But to me, if I'm going to do anything that isn't going to fill up my canner jar, then I've spent a whole lot of effort for a pretty minimal output. And I'd rather just have a refrigerator or fermented pickle anyway at that point. Basic science of pickling. Pickling essentially is preserving a low acid food safely. And that's a pretty, again, broad, brief definition. So let's talk a little bit more about what that means. When it comes to pickling, truly acidic foods can be preserved safely as is, but most fruits and things that we grow, but most vegetables and things have a pH that is higher than 4.6. And that means that they either need to be pressure canned if you want to preserve them, or frozen, or you can pickle them, add acid in, they become a pickle, then you get a lower pH value. So the lower the pH value, the more acidic the food, which makes this pH of 4.6 our magic number. And this is a chart from the US Department of Agriculture that they use in their canning publications, talking about pH in food. So this gives you a little sense of what we're talking about here. If you're used to thinking of pH in terms of acidic and alkali for your soil, then we're really just talking about everything below the neutral line here. And so everything is acidic, but some things have a low acid level, which means in order to safely preserve them, kill bad bacteria, prevent botulism, all those kind of things. They need to be preserved in a pressure canner. Whereas acidic foods can be pressure canned or water bath canned safely in terms of their pH. So when you look at this chart here, you'll see that most of our fruits are up there at the top level, where they have a really low pH number, which means they're quite acidic. So that's why you can make jams in a water bath canner out of most of your fruits and things. Tomatoes, we're getting a little bit closer to the cusp. So a lot of times these days, if you're going to can and preserve, then there's a recommendation to put a little bit of acid into the jar just to be on the safe side. And then once we get into vegetables, beyond the tomato line here, you can see that almost everything down there is vegetable and has too high of a pH to be canned unless you use a pressure canner, which means they're prime candidates for pickling most of the time. And as you can see here, it's in the pictures in the chart, not everything is at the same level. So some things have within that low acid range, some things have even less acidity than others. Peppers, just over the cusp. Peas, pretty close to that neutral line. So when it comes to preserving and canning, that's why you'll see different variations of acids and volumes and things like that. So pickling has two aspects to it. One is to make it safe and to be able to keep it whether you can it or refrigerate it or ferment it. But the other is also a flavor aspect. When you eat a pickle, you expect things to be pretty sharp, tangy, sometimes sour. And so to get that, you've got a kind of this magic number of the 4.6 that is your safe ratio. But we've also got this idea that if we put in a certain level, we can pickle just about anything. So with vinegar pickles, that's our 50-50 rule. Equal parts, 5% acidity vinegar and water, can pickle just about anything and be safe. And with fermented pickles, our 5% brine concentration, which is 12 grams of salt in a cup of water, also is enough to pickle just about anything. So if you're uncertain of what you're looking at, if you're looking at a new pickling recipe and you're just not sure, a good place to start is to look at that number and see, are they saying put in equal parts vinegar and water? Are they giving me a brine concentration? And when you look at those things, that gives you a clue about whether you're coming up with what may be a safe recipe. It also means that if you're like, I'm going to pickle a jar of these odds and ends and make a girandara and have cauliflower and broccoli and whatever else in there. If you hit this equal part vinegar and water, then you're pretty good shape to do a refrigerator pickle and not have to be concerned about how long it's been in there if anything unwanted is going to continue to grow in your jar. So yes, we're going to show our video now. We're on to that slide. So let me go back here. Before we move on to that, I did want to make one other point here, and that is that we're going to talk heading forward about both some vinegar pickles and some fermented pickles. So when we're doing our vinegar pickles, we're looking at tangy, tasty pickles tend to be preserved in vinegar. So if you're tasting a pickle, it's got that tangy bite, you're probably looking at a vinegar pickle. Sour pickles are usually a salt preserve, and they're using lacto fermentation to create that acidity. So that salt and water takes the natural bacteria that are in the vegetables, the natural good bacteria, and preserves the vegetables that way. So you end up with this sour. And either way, you're getting an acidity level that's going to kill the harmful bacteria that are in the jar and let the good bacteria go shine through. And so if you think about these ratios and keep them in the back of your mind as you're preparing your pickles, then you'll be able to start playing and experimenting with what works for you, especially when you're talking your fresh pickles, your refrigerator, your quick pickles. You can put in some herbs and spices and other flavorings. They're not going to affect that balance because you've got such high levels of acidity and salt going on when you use these particular ratios as kind of our top end here. So let me show you how that really works. We're going to move to a video that we shot for Land to Hand, Montana and Free the Seeds. And it's a demo of asparagus quick pickles, which are one of the first pickles I make in the growing season. I'm going to stop my share here so Sophie can take over with a video. Hi, I'm Julie Laing. I am the author of the food blog Twice as Tasty and also of the cookbook, The Complete Guide to Pickling. And today I'm going to be sharing one of the recipes from that cookbook for quick pickles. I call it spring asparagus. You can make it any time of year and with a different variety of ingredients, which I will explain to you as we get to that point. But as a quick pickle, what we're going to do first is make it quick, easy, fast. We're going to start off with our brine. Brine, in this case, we're making equal parts water and vinegar. The vinegar is a white wine vinegar with a 5% acidity. And we're going to put that into our pot. We're adding 1.5 cups of that vinegar. We're also going to add the same volume of water. Non-chlorinated water is going to make you better pickles in all instances, even with a quick pickle. And by doing equal ratios of water and vinegar, we're going to have a good pickling balance that also safely pickles our food. So we're going to give that guy a little heat here. And part of the reason we're giving it a little heat is so that we can add our sugar, a little bit of sugar in this recipe, and our salt. In this case, I'm adding a Morton pickling salt. And with the heat, those will dissolve even faster than we would if we were to just stir them. The other reason that we're going to heat up this brine is with something like asparagus that's really tough compared to some other vegetables, really thick and dense. It'll break it down faster, which is especially important with a quick pickle. You want it to pickle quickly, ideally. So we're going to get this brine warm and heated up there to dissolve our sugar and salt and pickle our asparagus. The third thing it's going to do for us by having warm brine is we're going to put in some whole spices, and that heat will help them infuse better into the brine. We're going to do that as soon as this liquid comes to a boil. So now that we've got our brine at a full boil, you can see it's fully dissolved the salt and the sugar. We can go ahead and turn that heat off, but while it's still super hot, we're going to add our aromatics. I'm going to add about a teaspoon of black peppercorns. I'm going to do the same with some mustard seed. And I'm going to use, you can use a little bit of chili flake or dried chilies. These are my favorite. We home smoke our own dried chilies, give them a lovely flavor, crumble a little of those in there. And then we're going to let that just sit here off of the heat, let the flavors infuse for about 5 minutes. And then we can go ahead and put it together with the food we're actually pickling, in this case, our asparagus spears. While you might be used to thinking of pickles as something that's always done in a jar, with a quick pickle, you don't necessarily have to. This large glass container is going to be great for our quick pickled asparagus. We've cut the asparagus to a length that'll fit inside there, which is really all you need. So if you have a longer, wider, or a longer, flatter container that's not nearly as wide, you can go even longer on your asparagus spears. We're going to add our asparagus spears to the container, and as you can see, they're going to kind of need to be maneuvered around in there with the round container and the long asparagus. I'm also going to put in a couple of scallions, green onions. You can use walking onions in the spring as one of my preferred options. I'll also in the spring do my early spring garlic and do it long cuts. It's going to look a lot like this going into my container. Tuck those guys in there as well. Since we aren't in spring and we've just got our out of season garlic and our whole head of garlic, I've gone ahead and minced that. But like I said, if you use spring garlic, you can just add a section in there like you normally would to add your scallions and garlic in the same way. Once we've got our garlic in there, then we can pour over our brine. It's still quite warm because it's only sat for 5 minutes, but that 5-minute window is let you infuse these flavors in here. We're going to go ahead and just pour it right over the top. If you have purple asparagus, it pickles up beautifully, but it will lose some of its color into the brine. Grab out the last little bit of goodness here. And as you can see, we've got just about enough brine in this container to cover our spears here, which is exactly what we're after. Now, quick pickles, in my definition, can be anywhere from 30 minutes, even 10 minutes for a sumanoma pickle, to up to several hours. In this case with asparagus spears, they're so thick and dense, you want them sit for about an hour or two before you start to eat them, but then they're going to be totally ready to go. If you're going to keep them in the refrigerator for a long time, you can strain all these spices out of there after they've infused in their brine, and then they won't get too overpowering as they sit in there, because they will keep for several months this way in the fridge. As soon as they've cooled down enough, pop on the lid, and you're set to go. Those are our spring asparagus or quick asparagus pickles from the Complete Guide to Pickling. I'm Julie Laing with Twice as Tasty. Thanks so much. We have got them all up on the YouTube channel for Free the Seeds Montana, and they will be on the video channel for Land to Hand after the event on their Free the Seeds video page as well. And I believe we're going to get them emailed out to everyone who was here in this workshop too, because I have not only the quick pickle video for you, but we also filmed videoing refrigerator asparagus pickles and fermented asparagus pickles. So we're going to talk now about how using one vegetable, all of those pickles differ a little bit, but are going to give you 3 different options in terms of time frame, flavor, how long they're going to keep, where you're going to store them, those kind of things. So asparagus quick pickles, the spring asparagus pickles that you just watched. Like I said, those are one of the first ones I usually make in the spring because I'm just ready to have some freshly made pickles. I shared them in my column just this last week in the Flathead Beacon. So the full recipe link is there at the bottom. We'll get that in the chat and things to you guys as well. So there's an opportunity there to not only see the recipe, go back with the video, but we're going to talk about a little bit here about what you just saw. And with the quick pickle, as I mentioned earlier, I'm working with a 50-50 water to vinegar ratio. In this case, a white wine vinegar with a 5% acidity. You don't necessarily have to have a 50-50 ratio for a quick pickle if you're not going to be keeping it very long. But I think that it's a very good idea to do and usually go that route all the time. 1, because it's easy to remember and figure out. 2, it gives me a pickle that tastes like what I expected a pickle to taste like. And also, then if I do keep it around, in the case of an asparagus quick pickle, even though it's quick and ready within a few hours, it can last for several months in the fridge. And then I know, oh, it got shoved in the back and I forgot about it, something like that. It's still going to be good and great and easy to go with. I also use either a pickling salt or a flaky kosher salt when I'm doing quick pickles. In this case, it's just more for flavor than it is for preservation. Whereas with a fermented pickle where there's no vinegar, it's all about the salt. Here, it's just really for flavor. Throw in some raw cane sugar or another sweetener, and then our seasonings and our spices to go in there. When I make this in spring, in my garden, I usually have Egyptian walking onions that come up early along with the garlic. And then I'll have my first garlic sprouting up that was planted in the fall. So I will pickle with the Egyptian walking onions and with the young garlic and the asparagus. It makes a really delicious pickle. Obviously for this video, we were doing this before the garlic crop came in. So the garlic I used was just a head of minced garlic and then scallions, green onions, which are also a fabulous option to put into this combination. So the process that we did for the quick pickle in the video is really straightforward. You mix your 50-50 brine, you pour it over the vegetable, and then you let it sit there. And in the case of asparagus, we're letting it sit there for a couple of hours because an asparagus is a pretty thick, dense vegetable, and it takes a little while to work that vinegar into the vegetable. For something like a sunonomo, the traditional Japanese salad you might get before sushi with thinly sliced cucumbers, you can make those and pour the brine over them and be ready to eat them in about 10 minutes. So it really varies a little bit in that time frame in terms of what vegetable you use. But after a couple hours, these asparagus will be great and ready to go. Now, since they are thicker, we did the optional step here of heating the brine before we poured it over the asparagus. That's going to help to get everything infused a little bit faster. It also dissolves our salt and sugar really quickly instead of having to sit and stir it. And it gave us a chance to let the spices infuse into the brine a little bit, which is also a nice thing if you're going to have a quick pickle versus one that sits around for a while where the spices really have a long time to get settled and flavored in there. So that's an optional step when you're making a quick pickle, especially if you're going to do something like a cucumber. You probably don't want to heat it. You want to just let it be as crisp and crunchy as it possibly can. So our asparagus quick pickles, really, it's about 10 minutes of time to make the recipe and about 5 minutes of infusing time since we heated up the brine and put in the spices. Ready to eat in a couple of hours. So it's certainly still a quick pickle in my book because you can have it ready in time for a dinner party if you put it together before you start doing all your other dinner prep. It can sit there and do its thing and be ready for your appetizer plate. So it's a very good option and a good way to make a quick pickle when you only have a little bit of produce. You want to eat it pretty soon and you're ready to pull all your ingredients together and put it all together. So we've got a couple questions in the chat. Let's go ahead and take those now.
All right, so we have a question from Tricia, and she would like to grow her own yellow mustard seed. Do you have any seed sources for those?
I do not have a seed source for growing yellow mustard seed. That may be one to reach out to a Box of Rain for and see if they have a connection with that. It is not a spice that I grow myself, and I'm not quite sure how well the seed grows in our climate. I do grow mustard for the greens, and I do save the seed to regrow, but it's a different kind of seed than the yellow mustard seed.
All right, we also have another question from Sam. She wants to know if she prefers her pickles not to be sweet. Could you skip the sugar, if that's okay?
Absolutely. Yes, you can certainly skip the sugar. In this case, we are sugar and the salt in this pickle are both really just options for flavor. This pickle, I do believe I put a fair amount of sugar into my recipe just for the variety that some people do like to have sweet pickles. I personally am not one who does a lot of sugar, so you can certainly cut that back. And in almost all cases, your option sugar-wise when it comes to a pickle is really just your choice and your flavor preferences. When it comes to something like a jam or a preserve, then now we're talking about a sugar that's going to be integral to how the process goes and how well something sets up. But when it comes to a pickle, sugar is usually almost always about just the flavor.
Thank you. And for our final question, Katie would like to know if you have to use pickling salt and vinegar, or can you just use regular vinegar and salt?
So yes, you can use regular, but it depends on what your definition of regular is. Let's talk first about vinegar. When it comes to vinegar, it's really a good idea to get a vinegar that has at least 5% acidity or higher, especially if you're going to be canning pickles. Canning recipes are all written, any good canning recipe is going to be written for that level of acidity. So when you go to dilute it with water, you're getting the right ratio. There is math you can do to calculate for a lower level of vinegar, but then you have to start doing some math. So it is easiest to use a vinegar that's 5% or higher. In that range, you've got a lot of options. White wine vinegar is one of my preferred vinegars for pickling. Some people do use distilled vinegar. I prefer that for cleaning, but it does neutralize all of your flavors. Sometimes, depending on what I'm making, I'll use a red wine vinegar. I'll use a different type of vinegar in there, but I'm always looking for that 5% number. When it comes to salt, you can certainly use other kinds of salt. The one I would stay away from is iodized salt or any other salt that has any sort of anti-caking agent or preservative in it. That's going to make your pickles cloudy. It's not necessarily going to do anything bad to them, but it will make the brine a little bit cloudy. There is a chance with some vegetables that it could soften things as well. So pickling and canning salt are both good options. I'm going to talk a little bit more about my preferred salts when we get to the ferment discussion a little bit later, and I'll go into those there. And on that note, there is one other thing to point out when it comes to vinegar and pickling and canning. There has become available a product that's being sold, I believe it's by Heinz, that is they're selling it as pickling vinegar that's got salt and vinegar and dilution already done for you, where you're supposed to be able to just pour it all over the vegetable and make a pickle in an instant. It's not my preferred option to use, because they've already decided how salty, how sweet, everything for me. And if you've gone to all the work to grow your own vegetables, then the idea of mixing together a little vinegar and salt seems like it's a pretty straightforward process that you might as well do to make all your lovely homegrown vegetables at their peak. If you do decide to use the pre-mixed pickling brine and salt, the thing to know is that it is almost always been already diluted for you with water. So you'll want to check and make sure, but for the most part, you are not going to then want to add any water when you go to make your brine. So thanks for those. We'll get to some other questions at the end here. But for now, let's move on to our next kind of pickle. And these are refrigerated and processed pickles. As I mentioned before, refrigerator pickles, I think, are great if you just want to make one jar at a time. You fill the jar, you only need about a pound of produce and your brine, and you're ready to go. You're done, one jar, all set, ready to go. For the most part, processed pickles, which you can in a water bath and then store, if you use a similar recipe and you're using your safe 50-50 vinegar water ratio, then for the most part, you're all set up to can those pickles if you want to go bigger with your favorite jar of refrigerated pickles. So it's something to keep in mind. Some pickles can better than others, and you lose crispness a lot of times. You lose texture when you heat process, which is what you have to do, water bath, heat it all the jar up and everything to seal it. So those are things to keep in mind when you're going to refrigerate your pickles, and then decide, oh, I really like this, I want to do a big batch of it. Do I want to can it? So in my pickling cookbook, I did some recipes that are specifically for canning processed pickles, but I also did several recipes that have an option to can them, and you can just scale it up to the number of jars that you want to make. But most of the things that I tend to can that fall in the pickle category are things where I'm not concerned about the texture. They're my relishes, they're chutneys and salsas. Those are the things that I'll do in the larger batches and can for the most part. When it comes to asparagus, though, you do have that option to come up with your pickled asparagus spears and then say, oh, my asparagus crop is ginormous this year, I want to can them now. They'll get a little bit softer as they go through the processing, but if you follow a recipe that is the 50-50 of water to vinegar, then you're going to be set up for canning, and you'll just need, your jar size and your processing time and things. So pickled asparagus spears, I usually make those later on in the season when my asparagus crop starts to get bigger. I still tend to do them only in the refrigerator, but if I do have a big year, then I may can them up. And for this, I use a basic dilly spice blend when I make asparagus spears for refrigeration. They're the whole spices. I'm going to let these sit in the refrigerator longer before I eat them, so they get time to infuse their flavor into the brine and work that in really well. And I also love them with garlic and a little bit of lemon for kind of this fresh sunshiny bite, especially as a refrigerator pickle. Again, pickling or flaky kosher salt and raw cane sugar or my other sweetener are really just for flavor preferences. So when you go to make your pickled asparagus spears, it looks pretty similar to what we just saw with the quick asparagus pickles. The process really is quite the same. We're going to pack the jar, mix and heat the brine, pour it over the vegetables, let it cool, and then we're going to let it refrigerate for days to weeks before we eat it when we're making our refrigerator pickle. It's pretty much the same process, pretty much the same timing. We're going to let it sit there a little bit longer. Some of that's for the whole spices, the whole clove of garlic that's going to go in instead of the minced garlic. Give those times things to break down and store. You have the option when you're doing a refrigerator pickle to cool the brine down if you want, and then pack it over your jar. With asparagus, I tend to pour it in hot because, as we talked about before, they get really, the dense asparagus, it breaks into the cells a little bit faster if it's warm when it goes in there. If I'm going to do a fridge pickle, say with zucchini, which is one of my favorite refrigerator pickles, I'll cool that brine first because I'm going to let it sit there long enough that I don't necessarily need to have it breaking down. And the zucchini have so much more water content in them and are softer to begin with. We'll keep them nice and crisp. If you decide, I love this asparagus pickle, I want to can it. Now, the step that you need to do when you're doing the actual making of the pickle is make sure that everything is staying hot because it's going to go into your hot canner. Pack it in the hot brine, and pack it into jars that are hot, pour the brine that's over it into hot, get it all set to process in that canner while everything still stays warm. So once you think about that, you're thinking, okay, well, we've got heat here, and then I'm going to run it through the canner. As you can imagine, your asparagus pickles at canned are probably going to be a little bit softer than your refrigerator ones, but they're still going to be really delicious, and you're going to appreciate the fact that you've got them long after the asparagus season is over. With our basic fridge pickle, something like pickled asparagus spears, prep time is a little bit longer as we're heating up that brine and things. And obviously we've got some cooling time in there if we want to let them cool down before we pour it over. But otherwise, they're ready to eat in just a few days. You can certainly let them sit longer. They're going to keep for months in your refrigerator. The last category of pickles I want to touch on today are fermented pickles. This is kind of a whole different process of pickling compared to what you might be used to when you're working with vinegar. Here we're talking about a salt brine, and it's all about the salt and the thyme, but the reward is you get really flavorful, really crisp, crunchy pickles. If they never see heat, then everything just happens slowly and naturally, and you develop some quite delicious pickles by going the fermented route. It's become one of my favorite techniques for making pickles. And as you can see, the jars I have here with some pickled cucumbers, the brine gets a little cloudy as they sit, and you get that little bit of hint that, oh, there's something that's been going on in there. But you can see they still stay bright and crisp and colorful inside the jar and are going to be really delicious on your plate. So we had the question earlier about salt. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that now, because with fermenting, it really is all about the salt. I mentioned earlier that a 5% brine concentration is pretty much going to guarantee you can pickle almost anything that you're going to grow in your garden. That's 12 grams of salt in a cup of water. That is actually a really high brine concentration. It's not as high as the day where you were supposed to put in so much salt that an egg could float in the thing, and then you had to rinse and rinse the pickles in order to make them even edible. But it is a really high brine concentration, and I tend to use that only for a few pickles where I want that really deep sour flavor. A smoky full sour cucumber pickle, if you're used to fermented pickles, big barrels, they talk about full sours, half sours. Full sours are going to come with that 5% brine concentration. And the version that I do of that, I put in lapsang tea. Tea has some tannins in it that the theory goes is that they help to keep everything crisp. They also create a really fun flavor in your pickle. I also do a 5% brine concentration for kohlrabi pickles. Dilly, mustardy, lots of mustard seed in there. There's a lot of spice and flavor going on. They can handle that big brine, especially with the dense vegetable that's a kohlrabi. But for most vegetable pickles, I go with a 3% brine concentration. That'll be your half sour cucumber pickles. That's my hot sauces. Asparagus, I do 3.5% brine. It's still safe. It's still going to preserve everything, but it's going to not be quite as intense at the end of it. And you're going to end up with a pickle that is full of flavor, but isn't just going to be so over the top. Some things that you dry salt for example, like cabbage for coleslaw and things like that, you might even have a lower brine concentration. It's really about getting those bacteria going, and the process and how you monitor it helps make sure that everything happens in the time frame and the good bacteria take over and the bad bacteria don't have a chance to move in. With the salt, I prefer for pickling and preserving either a pickling and canning salt like the Morton, or my favorite salt is actually Diamond Crystal's kosher salt. And what you're looking for there, when you look at a box and say, I'm going to use this salt and I'm going to pickle with it, the first thing you're going to look for on it is what's in the ingredient list. It really should just say salt. If it says anything else, then there's a chance it's going to make your pickle brine cloudy. It could soften your pickles, things like that. So a good place to start is with something that says just salt on the box. Now, the thing to know about these two varieties that I show here, and when you think about, I'm going to use whatever salt I just happen to have, is salt varies quite significantly in how much it weighs versus volume. And most people are used to being, especially if they're going to make a quick pickle, they're going to measure out a teaspoon of salt. Well, a teaspoon of Morton canning salt is actually twice as salty as a teaspoon of Diamond Crystal salt, because the Diamond Crystal salt is so flaky and it weighs half of the volume. So that's something to keep in mind when, especially when you're going to go and ferment something. Your salt ratio is going to change significantly if you use a different salt than what's called for in the recipe. And it has a very significantly different weight. So most of the time when you find, that's why you'll find, okay, we're using a cup of water. A cup of water can be fine in our volume measurement, but you'll find the salt ratios for ferment recipes usually come in grams, so that you can make sure whatever type of salt you're using the right size. If you've got one that comes with a volume measurement, double check that to make sure that it's for the salt that you're going to want to use, so that you don't end up being way too salty for whatever you're trying to preserve. So for our fermented asparagus pickle, again, it's another way to pickle asparagus, but you can pickle all sorts of vegetables in a ferment. It's a slightly different process than if we're using vinegar. We're going to pack our jar like we would otherwise, but instead of mixing together our vinegar and our water, we're going to mix together our water and our salt. And as I said, for the asparagus pickle, I do a 3% salt brine and 3.5% salt brine, excuse me. And I like the Diamond Crystal kosher salt because it's so flaky. I can put that into the water. I can stir it with a fork and it dissolves almost immediately. And I don't have to heat it up at all. If you're using a salt that doesn't dissolve very quickly, you may want to heat your water up so that the salt will dissolve better, and then let all that cool before you pour it over your vegetable. Once you get your ferment going, it's going to, for an asparagus pickle, it ferments for 1 to 3 weeks before you eat it, and then you refrigerate it to store it. So the process of putting it together is really quite quick. What takes the time is the fermentation itself. While you're watching and waiting, there's a few things that help keep it going well and let you be pretty hands-off about it. You're really letting the bacteria do all their work. You don't want to be a micromanager about it. You want to let them go about their business. But at the same time, you need to make sure that you've set them up for success. So what you will do when you're fermenting, instead of sealing that jar straight away with any sort of a lid that you don't pay any attention to, you want to keep an eye on what's going on in there, because that jar is going to change as it sits. And you're going to need 2 things to really help that happen without other bacteria moving in and trying to spoil your pickles before they have a chance to fully form. One of those is something that keeps the oxygen and the pests out. And the other thing is a weight that keeps the food submerged in the brine. That's probably the most important part. If any of the food is exposed above the brine, obviously it's not having a chance to lock out the bad bacteria, and that's where you're potentially going to find mold or other things that start to move in and grow. If you keep it all below the brine, everything's going to be in contact with the salt brine that's making it all happen, and it's going to work really well. So the weight and the cover are two great things. When I first started fermenting, I literally just took a plastic zip close bag, filled it with extra brine just in case there was a leak. I didn't want just pure water to leak in my ferment, and stuffed that in the top of the jar. And it does a pretty good job of keeping things weighed down, and it does a pretty good job of keeping the air out. And it's not as good as some of the other tools that are out there, but it certainly got me started on fermentation, and it's a really affordable way to see if this is something you want to try to do. If you decide you're getting into fermenting, then you've got all sorts of options when it comes to covers, and especially these days when it comes to covers that go onto jars. Fermenting in jars is becoming more and more popular, although fermentation crocks are also available and lovely and do an amazing job, especially if you get one with a waterlock top or a lid that's, designed to go for it. They can be more expensive, and obviously they take up more space. So a lot of people have turned to fermenting in jars. On the right of the picture here, you can see several of the different varieties of fermentation setups that I have and have used, and weights. And all of those are some form of an airlock or a waterlock. So they keep the oxygen out, but at the same time, they let carbon dioxide escape, letting your brine and ferment grow really well. And then there's some weights in there as well to help keep the food submerged. So there are all sorts of options out there when you choose to start fermenting. I talk about those some more in my book, of course, and there's all sorts of places to find more information about that online and on my blog as well. So while you're watching and waiting, you end up with your fermented asparagus pickles. Prep time, super easy, maybe 15 minutes. And they're ready to eat in 1 to 3 weeks. So you can see these pickles here. The one on the left is the same pickle that is in the video that I've made to go along with this. And it's also the same pickle that was shown when I first started talking about the asparagus pickles. I'm going to sneak back to that slide. These guys here, that's the same jar of pickles. So as you can see, this is what it looked like when it first got set up. And then this is what the jar will look like when it's fully fermented. The one on the right is one that, the one on the left is probably about 1.5 weeks into its ferment. The one on the right is one that is currently in my fridge from the last jar of fermented asparagus that I have from last year. I probably made it late in the season last year. And so it's been sitting in there. As you can see, it's even cloudier than the one on the left. And that's something that's important to recognize. Once you're done and your ferment is ready to go and you pop it in the fridge to store it, the refrigerated temperatures really just slow the fermentation way, way down, but it can still continue to ferment. So you may see some change in cloudiness and things like that as it goes on, and color obviously as well. So the refrigerated and the fermented pickles, those, as I said, we've got videos for those as well to share with you. They're already up on the YouTube channel, and they're going to be on the video archive at landtohandmontana.org, along with this complete workshop once those all get archived up there. So keep your eyes peeled for those. And we are going to try to get videos out in email to everybody as well, so you can see the demos that all have to do with the asparagus pickles that were the focus of where we were talking with everybody today. So we are done with what I've got prepared for my portion of the presentation. We've got plenty of time to take some questions. But before we wrap up, I just want to go back over what we were talking about, see if any other questions get sparked in your brain as we think back to it. When it comes to pickling your garden, really, you can pickle an awful lot of it, from asparagus to zucchini. The photo that you see here, I have some spicy vinegar that has pickled peppers in it. There's a jar of pickled vinegar, or sorry, a jar of pickled garlic in vinegar. There's a pineapple salsa. Pineapple became one of my favorite things, even though I can't grow it here, to pickle when I was writing my book, because I can use the rind to make a beverage. I can pickle the fruit inside, and I can turn that pickle into a salsa or just eat it as is. It's really delicious. Obviously, some pickled asparagus there. Looks like I've probably got some sort of a hot sauce or a curry paste up top. Pickled rhubarb, fermented rhubarb has become another one of my fun favorites, because obviously around here grow rhubarb like crazy, and it always goes into sweet things. When you ferment it, it gets this sour flavor, and I love it in like a couscous and other types of dishes. I've got a great recipe in my pickled picnic cookbook. Pickled cocktail onions have become another fun favorite one. I don't tend to grow them that size, but they pickle up really well. And pickled pears also are shown in that screen. That is another one that I've come to enjoy. They are definitely a sweeter pickle. They're great with like a really sharp cheddar cheese and some sourdough bread. And when you're finished with it, you end up with a brine that has enough sweetness in it that it can be turned into a drinking shrub without any other preparation. Shrubs aren't something I got into today, but they're a vinegar, basically the vinegar version of kombucha. And you make a concentrate, you dilute it with fizzy water, and you can drink it as is or in a cocktail. And the pickled pears, their brine is immediately ready for that in my mind. So, so we've got lots of fun options when it comes to playing with pickles and what you can preserve in your garden. The basic science of pickling, again, we're just trying to preserve our low acid food safely, whether that means we're preserving it in the fridge, whether we're going to can it. Even if we're only going to make a quick pickle and I'm going to make it and eat it because I want to pickle right now and there's no real long-term preservation involved, we're going for that flavor. So we're still going to follow some of those same basic rules of preserving in order to, and basic science of pickling in order to keep everything tasting and behaving like a pickle should. And as we talked about, you can make pickles for any schedule or any occasion. So you can have quick pickles that are ready in minutes. You can make them while you're preparing dinner, before you prepare dinner, have them ready to go. Refrigerator pickles, they take a little more time usually to sit, but their preparation can be just as speedy as a quick pickle. Fermented pickles, definitely more time. You definitely want to plan ahead if you're going to do those, but the rewards are just great. And processed pickles, if you're going big, then canning is going to be a great way to preserve everything, keep it shelf stable, have it there to go and reach into all winter long while your garden's under snow. So as we said at the beginning, pickling is safe, easy, endlessly variable, and it's a lot of fun. I love pickling. I love preserving and growing my own food. And the idea that I can grow something in my garden and I can eat it for dinner tonight in the middle of March when, you know, everything's still in mud season right now, or even a month ago when it was all under snow, is a really fabulous thing in my mind. So there are lots of options to learn more about pickling with me, and of course with Free the Seeds and Land to Hand Montana, who've been so fabulous about helping everybody get their hands and learn more about seeds, growing them, preserving them, using them, giving that complete chain of our food system. Obviously, besides my books and things, be sure to check out my blog. There are lots of recipes there for pickles, as well as information and techniques and how-tos. I did an entire post on some of the tools you need for pickling, preparing to pickle. So definitely check those things out. My Twice as Tasty column in the Flathead Beacon, some of those things are pickles, some are other things. It's going to be a lot of fun as we go into the growing season to be able to tailor that column to things that happen here in our gardens in Montana. So look for a lot of fun recipes that will use things out of your gardens. And as we said, the workshop video archive, we're going to have this workshop up there and all of the demo videos as well that relate to our pickling workshop today. So I'm going to let Sophie start running some questions through. Let's see what we got.
All right, thanks, Julie. Sam would just love to learn about any safety tips related to botulism, if you have any.
Sure. So botulism is kind of this big scary B word that gets thrown around in the preserving world. And what it basically means is you've tried to take a low acid food and you have tried to put it onto a shelf where it's not meant to live long term, and nasty bacteria have moved in. Botulism is not a laughing matter. If it does occur, it can be very serious. The thing about botulism is that the spores that cause that, they grow naturally in all the soil and all the ground. It's all over the place. So it's only when those spores are released in this low acid sealed environment that's where it starts to become a problem. So the first thing that ensures you don't have any concerns about that when it comes to pickling is your acidity ratio. As soon as you pickle something and you're working with that 50-50 ratio, you're not going to get botulism. The acidity level, the pH is way too low for those spores to disperse and move into your space. So there's no real concern there if you're actually pickling something. That's part of the reason, even if I'm not going to can it, I aim for those kind of ratios because I know that it's going to sit in my fridge for a while and it's going to be just fine to eat. Not all recipes are going to be 50-50 ratios. So sometimes that's not a problem because that food already has so much acidity in it that it's not necessary to go that level. But for the most part, that's what you're looking for when you're making your pickled brine. And so don't have to worry if you're going to go that route and you're going to do it with the vinegar. If you're going to process it and close it in a sealed jar, that becomes particularly important because that's the other part of the botulism factor is I've sealed this up and I'm going to put it on a shelf. The bacteria are not going to grow in a freezer environment, so you can freeze all of your vegetables and not have to worry about botulism. And they're going to be unlikely to grow in your refrigerator in your short time frame if you've put something in there. You're going to get mold or something before you even come to that point. But if you have food that's spoiling in your fridge. So that airtight seal is the other factor. That's really the environment those spores want to grow in. And that's why our ferments work as well. We've come up with, when you come up with your salt brine and you start to ferment the food, the botulism spores don't have a chance to move in there and they change that pH just as much as vinegar does. It just takes more time.
Awesome, thank you. Mary just wants to know if it is okay to use pickle or olive juice from a purchased pickle refrigerator pickles.
So yes, you can reuse brine. The things to keep in mind when you're going to reuse a brine are, first of all, where that brine came from. If you're going to buy pickles and then try to reuse your brine, take a look at what's inside that brine and see if you actually want to try to use it again. You don't know when you've bought your pickle, you don't know what they did for their ratios and their numbers. So you're a little bit more unknown there. If you've made the brine yourself, then you know what went in there, but you also know one of the things that went in there was a vegetable. And it's going to, as the vinegar brine moves into the vegetable, the brine itself is going to get a little bit diluted. So I always make fresh brine if I am going to can anything. And I always make fresh brine if I'm going to ferment, because that ratio has changed as things have sat over time. And I've been emptying that jar of its pickles. But if I'm doing a quick pickle or a refrigerator pickle, things haven't been in there very long. If I started with my 50-50 ratio, I know I'm in pretty good shape, then yeah, those brines can have other vegetables go into them for sure. My preferred thing to do with brines though, is to put them to a different use rather than pickle in them again. Even a refrigerator pickle, if I've done a quick pickle and I made a Sunanomo and I'm going to eat it in 15 minutes, then yeah, I can maybe keep that brine and use another round if I need to. If I'm going to let it sit in the refrigerator for a month, then that's more of that dilution time. So then I may be less likely to reuse the brine as a pickle, but I'll use it for all sorts of other things. Brines are great for marinades and salad dressings. You can cook with them. for my fermentations, I often use my empty jars of pickle brine and I bake with them. I'll put them in my sourdough instead of water when I'm making a sourdough loaf, and it just adds tang and flavor and things to that. You can even make a pickle bread with actual pickle brine and portions and things in it if you want. So that's always kind of fun. Some brines are great as shrubs, as I mentioned with the pears. That's a fun one to turn into a drinking vinegar. And some can work well into sauces and things like that too. So there's a lot of different options. But yes, you can reuse your brines for your quick and refrigerator pickles. I would not recommend it for anything that's going to be canned or kept long term, and I wouldn't recommend it for a ferment. You really want to start from scratch with a fresh salt brine there.
All right, and Candace would like to know, can you tell us what the sodium content of the pickled asparagus would be for about 3 to 4 spears?
Of which pickled asparagus?
I'm not sure, but if you want to put that in the Q&A, we can get to it.
Yeah, let's
We'll move on to the next one until
yeah, pipe up and let us know which pickle you're interested in there. The quick pickle, the refrigerated pickle. Let me take a quick look. I do not have an exact number for you because I haven't done that kind of math. What I can tell you, if you want to make a note and run it through like a nutrition thing or something, is the way I've written my recipe for the refrigerated pickle. It's got half a teaspoon of Morton pickling salt, which is going to be, how many grams is that? Let's take a quick peek here. For half a teaspoon, we are probably talking about let's see. So 3 teaspoons is going to be 8 grams. So half a teaspoon. So 6/8, a third of a gram for half our teaspoon of salt. So it's a really low salt number. And then I'm putting in about 8 ounces of asparagus in a jar. So about 15 spears of asparagus. That all being said, so it's a pretty minimal, to my mind, a minimal amount of salt. But that all being said, if salt is a major concern for you with a refrigerator pickle, you could leave it out. It's for flavor as much as anything else. It does have a little effect on texture. It does have a little effect on vinegar and things like that. But it's mostly about flavor balance. So I'd say really, if it's a concern, I'd just start by leaving it out and not worry too much about how much is per spear.
All right, thank you. And Sam wants to know, were pressure canning and water baths any different from the pickling discussed here?
So yes, pressure canning and water bath are kind of next step processes when it comes to pickling. So if you want to think about pickling as we're going to be preparing these vegetables in this brine, and really all of them are destined for the refrigerator. If you follow the safe brine ratios and things like that, you may have the option to can them, but that's our next level of processing on top of the pickling. They are pickled when they go and they sit in their brine. The canning doesn't pickle them. The canning then lets you store them in a different way. When it comes to pickles, what you're really doing is you are lowering that pH of everything so that it is safe to water bath can is the goal. Pressure canning pickles is one, not necessary because you've lowered that acidity level. And 2, it's going to produce a really mushy product and usually isn't the recommended method to preserve something. So if you say want to just can your asparagus in water, and not have that vinegar flavor and not have that pickle flavor, then you're going to use your pressure canner because your asparagus is too much of a low acid food to safely water bath can in just water. But if you do want to pickle it, if you do want to add that vinegar, you add the 50-50 brine ratio. Now you've lowered the pH to the point where you can process it in your water bath canner instead.
All right, and do you ever use a pH test strip?
I do. I have a pH tester. I got it when I was working on the recipes for my pickling cookbook because I wanted to be especially sure that I was in the right numbers for things. pH testing is a little bit of home science going on. I recommend a pH meter if you're going to be doing a lot of ferments, and especially a lot of ferments of like hot sauces and things like that. It can be really helpful to be able to check when they're ready, because it's hard to tell. You're never going to tell just by a flavor or texture with those kind of things. But if you're doing your normal everyday pickling, your better bet is to follow a safe recipe. And there's several thoughts and options when it comes to that. The first is if you want to be really strict about it, and if you are new to pickling, it can be really advisable to follow a recipe from the National Center for Home Food Preservation or the US Department of Agriculture. Everything that they publish has been tested in a lab, and in a large lab, not just at home, with a pH meter and my ability to know how to use that properly as an individual who's not necessarily a scientist. So that's your greatest source, especially for canning recipes. And then from there, of course, obviously, I'm a writer. I'm a published author of recipes for canning and preserving and pickling. And so people like me who have done their due diligence, what we do is we look at those recipes and those numbers, and all of our calculations are based off of their science. It is very expensive to have recipes lab tested, and even major companies like Ball and Bradina and things like that that are selling canning equipment, you don't see a lot of new recipes come out from them because it's so expensive to do the lab testing. And there's so many variables when it comes to the foods and things like that, that are your starting base. Which variety of tomato you use can affect where you start with your pH and things. So your best bet is to follow recipes that have been based on the science and researched and studied, and the numbers align with what they've tested in those big labs and those big science areas. That all being said, canning and preserving when you're trying to make something shelf stable is really where you need to be cautious about making sure your recipes are spot on and you're following them to the letter. Because now we're trying to take something that's not meant to be stored for a year in a cupboard and stored in a cupboard. And so it's really important that not only that you follow the correct steps in the process, but that you also follow the correct ratios and numbers and things that are going to keep the food safe that's inside those jars and preserve it safely. When you're pickling, and we're talking about these really high ratios of vinegar and water and acidity that we're adding to a jar for a pickle, now we've moved beyond the point where we're on that cusp of, have I added enough acidity, to the point where there's definitely enough acid inside my jar. So you've got a little more leeway. You can be a little more flexible in how you choose to flavor and balance things. But if you still keep within those safe ratio ideas, then you're all set up for all sorts of other preserving and the right mindset to get you safely wherever you need to be in your garden and preserving world.
Thank you. And Mia would like to know when you should toss out your pickles.
Tossing out pickles kind of depends on which type of pickle you've made and how you've stored it, and whether there were issues in the process of making it. So really, when it comes to pickling, you pretty much shouldn't need to toss a pickle unless there's something that is obviously wrong with it to you. If your pickles weren't under their brine and you've got vegetables with mold showing on the top, that's an obvious reason where you're not going to want to eat that pickle. And when you have any sort of, damage that happens, the glass jar cracks or breaks and you're afraid you've got glass in there. That's another good reason not to eat a pickle jar. When it just comes in terms of, I've preserved it safely, it looks good, it tastes good, it's just been in my fridge for a really long time, is it still good to eat? Yes, it's still good to eat. Do you want to eat it? That becomes the question that you have to decide. The recommendation for most canned goods is to eat them within a year. And that doesn't have so much to do with safety at all. If the jar is still sealed and shelf stable, it will last on your shelf for several years, but it's going to have to do with quality and texture. And the same applies to pickles that go in the refrigerator. If I've got pickles in my refrigerator now that I canned, or in my refrigerator that I fermented or I made refrigerator pickles with at last growing season, and they're still great. They're still in great shape. They're holding up just fine. But some that I preserved as a quick pickle, I would have wanted, I've eaten them all up by now because they weren't going to last that long. They were going to lose their flavor and their bite. So I'm afraid that's a really vague answer to a rather specific question. But obviously, if it looks bad, smells bad, maybe something you don't want to put in your body, then that's one decision. If you're just thinking it's been in there a long time, I'm not sure, that's something where it's kind of personal preference, and see whether you still like the taste and the texture and it's worth eating.
Oh, thank you. I think that was a great answer. We have one more question, and it was just, how long can we keep used brine in the fridge for? Sam says they sometimes make fridge pickles and brine from store-bought pickles.
Yeah, the brine is going to be just as long lasting as the pickles, really, and in some cases even more, because you're still going to have more of the acidity in the brine itself than necessarily in the pickle. So brines can last in the fridge a really long time. The things I think about when I'm keeping a brine in the fridge is, one, mostly just, is it just sitting in there because I haven't found a use for it yet and it's eating up my shelf space? Then I tend to find a way to use up that brine. Another thing I think about if I'm keeping brines in the fridge is, do they have anything left in the jar with them? If you have whole spices, you can kind of see in the picture that's here of the cocktail onions on the right on my Pickle Picnic book, there's kind of a dark spot towards the start. That's a whole spice that's floating up toward the surface. If you have something like that going on, that's an opportunity for something in the jar to be exposed to air and bring a bacteria you don't intend into the jar inside. So if you're going to keep a pickle brine for a long time, sometimes it's a good idea to strain out anything else that might be sitting in there. But otherwise, they're going to last in your fridge as long as your pickles are.
Awesome. Thanks, Julie. And I think that would be our last question. I'm just going to wrap it up, but thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, Julie. You did such a good job presenting today, and I'm sure everybody here learned a lot. There are other webinars we have. If you are interested in checking them out, they're on landtohandmt.org. We just have a couple more. If you're wanting to donate, you can also go to landtohandmt.org, and there's a link for that. Always thank you to our sponsors. You're the reason and all our donations. This is the reason we can keep doing this every year. Next year, it should not be virtual. It should be in person. So that's very exciting. But we really look forward to being with you. And thank you again for joining us for our last virtual webinar. Thank you, guys. And thank you, Julie.